Please turn with me in your Bible to 1 Samuel chapter 21. But we're going to back up a little bit and to talk about chapter 20, just to kind of give us a little background of where we're at in case you missed last week and in case a week's gone by and you forgot a little bit. Of course, Saul at this time, he's dealing with a problem I think that plagues a lot of people. Is simple jealousy. You know, jealousy, if it's not on check, can destroy people and certainly could destroy marriages and could destroy friendship when jealousy is allowed to not only to root deep within somebody, but if it goes unchecked. And jealousy came into being where Saul was jealous of David. What had David ever done? He played a harp for him. He went out and fought the battles for the kingdom. The best we could tell up to this point, he's been a pretty, straight going forward guy, and he's been a really good part of the Saul's kingdom. But remember, at this point, the kingdom had been taken away, not physically from Saul, as Samuel came and confronted Saul because he disobeyed the Lord. And so he told him, he says, the kingdom now is going to be taken from you and given to another. Of course, we already know who it's been given to, don't we? It's been given to David. And so there was this great jealousy. But not only that, David and Saul's son, Jonathan, became very, very close friends. In fact, it got so much when all of a sudden Saul started seeing this happening. He says, David's my enemy. And what's my son now running with him? How come there's this bond? And you could see it really festering at Saul at this time. Jonathan believed that his dad was going to be upfront with him all the time. Be honest with his son. You know, at least Jonathan believed this. His dad up to this point had told him everything about the kingdom, told him everything that was going on, but he kept this back. And that's what jealousy does. It gets to the place where you become deceitful, dishonest with people, and all the way to be dishonest with his own boy. And so the story goes on. If you could drop down to verse 30 with that background of chapter 20. It says, Saul's anger was aroused against Jonathan, and he said to him, you son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, you shall not be established, nor your kingdom, nor now therefore send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die. Jonathan didn't realize that was in his dad's heart up to this point. But it's amazing when a fit of rage, what all of a sudden you could say something that you wouldn't necessarily say. You ever find yourself speaking? Of course, I've never had this problem with my wife, say things out of turn, right? But you find yourself talking, and all of a sudden you go, oh, come on back, words, come back. You try to grab them, and they just don't come back. And this is where Saul was saying he was in a place of rage, and jealousy has now controlling his life. And he told his son, he says, bring me that guy. Bring me David here because he needs to die. In verse 32, Jonathan answered Saul, his father, and said to him, why should he be killed? What has he done? Again, almost a precursor to Easter. Really, as Jesus stood before Pilate, and here's Barabbas, what evil has Jesus done? What did he do wrong? And notice verse 33. Then Saul cast the spear at him. At who? At Jonathan, to kill him. I tell you, I don't know about you, but I believe at this point that this jealousy has not only moved over to rage, but I think Saul now, as we move forward, has really hit the button where some might consider him to be insane. I'm not a clinical psychologist, but you see this act of rage being carried out. It happens all the time when people, come unglued. And one of the major violence that we see across our country, certainly within our cities, is domestic violence, don't we? We hear about it in the news all the time where this goes unchecked. And finally, they can't handle it anymore, and rage comes out to the point where he threw his spear to kill Jonathan, and Jonathan knew it. It was determined by his father to kill David, and Jonathan arose from that table in fierce anger, and he ate no more food the second day of that month, for he was grieved for David because his father had treated him shamefully. The second day of the month, of course, every month they were having these feasts. During the time of the full moon, they would have a 2-day feast. Where we were last week, of course, David didn't show up to either one of those feasts. Can you blame David not showing up at Saul's banquet? He knew that he was a man on the run. And so that's the picture, the background of chapter 21 when we opened up. David is a man on the run, a man that's been wrongly accused of doing bad. He had no friends that he could think of, nobody that he could trust. Actually, towards the end that we see in verse number 41, let's pick it up again. I'm sorry, let's back up a little bit. And he says, as soon as the lad had gone, David arose from a place towards the south and fell on the face to the ground and bowed down 3 times. And they kissed one another, and this is Jonathan and David, and they wept together, but David more so. Then Jonathan said to David, go in peace. Since we have both sworn, they made a pact between each other in the name of the Lord, saying, may the Lord be between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever. So he arose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. And so now we see the parting of these very, very close friends. You know, family squabbles separate people. And the best he thought, he says, you know what, we need to just move. And may God be between us. And so David's now on the run, running from Saul as Saul's trying to kill him. And it tells us that David came to Nob, to Abimelech, the priest, and Abimelech was afraid. And when he met David, he said to him, why are you alone and no one is with you? You have to picture where Nob is. If you go to present-day Jerusalem, as you start heading north and you go a little bit east, it's not very far, was this city called Nob. Really not much a large city, but it was a place where the priests were hanging out, where was actually a priestly cities, as they were given these different cities in the lands for them to dwell. And so this one priest saw David come to him, and he says, what are you doing here all by yourself? He was probably surprised because David at this point was been what known as being the captain over how many? A captain over 1,000. And he's probably looking, well, what are you doing out here by yourself? And so David said to Abimelech, the priest, the king has ordered me on some business and said to me, do not let anyone know anything about the business or on which I send you or what I have commanded you. It sounds like David's now entering into the CIA business. How about you? We don't really know, we haven't heard him say this, but he's making some type of story up why he's there. And I have directed my young men to such and such place. And now, therefore, what have you on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, and whatever can be found. David was hungry. Sometimes when you forget, we got it pretty easy in Southern California, don't we? We're never in a place of lack of food. I was looking the other day, as driving down Brookhurst, heading home, I go, how many restaurants does a man need just on my street? You go on any of your boulevards, right? They're all over the place, grocery stores. And if you run out of food, you can go get gas and go in there and get food. We got food. David was hungry. So he enters into this priestly town. He meets his priest, and he asks him for some bread. And the priest answered David in verse 4 and said, this is no common bread on hand. I mean, there is no common bread on hand. There's no Wonder Bread or anything that you can imagine, but there's only holy bread if the young men have at least kept themselves from women. And this idea is they've been pure for 3 days, where they haven't been with a woman. And the holy bread, of course, or else the showbread, you go all the way back to Leviticus, was part of the tabernacle settings, and where the bread was sit there in there, and that was part of their duties, was to provide fresh bread within the tabernacle. What does the bread mean to us as you fast forward? Doesn't it speak to us of Jesus, where Jesus said, I am the bread of life? And here this man is just doing a good job. He says, hang out, stand back, David. I understand you and I respect you, but this is the Lord's. I love that about this man. That first thing that he recognized that this, not only this bread belongs to the Lord, everything belongs to the Lord. And David answered the priest and said to him, truly, women been kept from us about 3 days since I came out, and the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is in effect common, even though it was consecrated in the vessels of the day. So the priest gave him bread, holy bread, for there was no bread there but showbread, which he had taken from before the Lord, in order to put hot bread in its place on the day when it was taken. I find it's interesting that we even have this story in the Bible, that this just happened. It's, these events. But of course, we find it's interesting because Jesus dealt with this, and he spoke about it in Matthew chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. Do you remember when Jesus was just walking through the field one day and he was just grabbing some wheat, and really what he was doing, his disciples were rubbing in his hands, and they were making some type of meal to be able to eat, and the Pharisees challenged Jesus to this, and he pointed them back to this story. He pointed back to this story where really what it was is that the bread at this time became the need of the people that superseded these orders that they found in Leviticus. Man's needs overrode what the ceremonial law brought. People were hungry and they needed to be fed. And Jesus says, what good is that bread sitting there when you got hungry people over here? That we should feed them and we should take care of them. And I think it's interesting that, that this guy used good judgment, told David that he could use the bread to feed these starving guys. And then in verse 7, it shifts gears. We're still at the same place. We're still there at Nob. And a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day and detained before the Lord. And his name was Doggett, or you might want to just call him a dog, because he was a real dog. He says, an Edomite, the chief of the herdsmen who belonged to Saul. And so Saul had hired this Edomite to oversee his flocks at this time. And David said to Abimelech, is there not here on hand a spear or a sword? David didn't have any. When he fled. He fled quickly. He didn't bring any of his weapons or tools that he needed to defend himself. For I had brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste. And now what's that king's business? They stay out of the way of the spears, right, that were being chucked at him. And so the priest said, the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Eli, there it is, wrapped in the cloth behind the ephah. If you will take it, for there is no other except that one here. And David said, there is none like it, give it to me. And so that must have been an exciting day to hear this sword that David once used to chop off what? The head of Goliath. And it was here resting there in the corner behind his ephod, wrapped up with his sword. And now it's in the hands of David. And David rose in verse 10. And he fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said unto him, is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing of him to one another in dances, and saying, Saul has slain his thousands, David his 10,000. What's interesting here about this King Achish, what town, or what province, what country is he, area that he's from? He's from Gath. Who else came from Gath that we know of? Goliath. And here he's returning to this area where Goliath came from. And as he's entering into this city, he's at the door, he's at the walls of the city. And it tells us in verse 12 that David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. We talked about this morning about how fear can really immobilize us. It has that way of entrapping us and keeping us from doing the things that God would have us to do. Bible tells us how fear will bring us to the place where it cripples us. Where it says, fear of man bringeth a man a snare, or else another way to say it, the fear of man brings us into an entrapment. It's almost like you've been caught in a spider web, and you happen to be that one little fly that flew in there, and there's no way that you're to get out. Fear has a hold of David. And as we mentioned this morning, the only way that you could escape fear that we all deal with, and as we went through, we saw that every great Bible person that we ever saw dealt with fear, even from Abraham to Moses to Elijah, and here in our story of David, they all dealt with fear. The way that you combat fear is the presence of the Lord in your life. When you become consciously aware of God, fear disappears. Fear certainly shows a lack of faith, doesn't it? It gets our eyes off the Lord, where we should be looking at Him and His strength, as David is now very much afraid of this king, the king of Gath. Wasn't very long ago, he came running at their great man, Goliath, that was over 9 feet tall. What happened to that David? Now he has his eyes off the Lord. And this king, he's trembling at his gate. And so he changed in verse 13 his behavior before the men, or before them, and pretended madness in their hands, and scratched on the door of the gate, and left his saliva fall down off on his beard. Is this the picture that you have of David? Not me. But this is what happens when we lose sight of God. When we lose sight of Jesus, we then fall back into those chains of confinement. And that's really what that is that fear brings us in that place of darkness. The beauty is that Jesus sets us free. He who has the Son is going to be what? Is going to be set free, is free indeed. When we keep ourselves in Christ, we can walk in the freedom. We don't, even though there's darkness all around, there's problems all around. I face problems just like you do. But my resolve is to keep my eyes on Jesus so I can experience that freedom, to experience that peace. And not to cave in to men like King Achish. And I'm sure David thought that he was probably going to be killed at this point. And it says in Achish, verse 14, said to his servants, "Look, you see, the man is insane. Why have you brought him to me? Have I a need of a madman, that you have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come down into my house?" He says, "Forget about it." David therefore departed them and came to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and all of his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. Notice Adullam, of course, is now further south from where he was at, in this cave there, and he found a place just to pretty much to rest. You know, he's been running now for a while. And it says, and everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, everyone who was in discontent, was discontented, gathered to him, and so he became captain over them, and there was about 400 men with him. Later on, we'll discover these 400 men really, you don't look at them as being the top tier of society, do you? The cream of the crop. Rather, the rejects of society. Here that David's out there, and his family goes out there, and they're all there. And as we're going to be reading farther down the road as we follow the life of David, these 400 men become tremendous warriors that come behind David and support him. And how God takes so often people that men really does cast off, and he uses them for his glory. See, people might look on the outside appearance, but God sees the heart, and he sees what he wants to do. So often with the outcasts, he uses it for his glory. And so everybody that was really distressed, or those in debt, I find that's interesting, and those who really were discontented, God brought them up to these caves, and David went from there to Mizpah of Moab, and he said to the king of Moab, now he's heading south, please let my father and my mother come here with you till I know what God will do for me. So he brought them before the king of Moab and dwelt with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. I really do admire David in a lot of different ways. One of the things I see is very admirable that we kind of lost a lot of times in the church and society in general is taking care of your parents and the elderly. Do you see where he says, I want to take care of my parents. I want to make sure they're safe. I don't know what's going to happen to my life. I'm on the run. So I want to take them to a place, a safe place where they can be taken care of. Would to God that we would that we would take care of one another, that we would have compassion on each other. And David was all about that. This stronghold that you see here in the end of verse 4, there's a lot who look at this down in that area, that this stronghold could have been, certainly the beginning places where later on King Herod built it out, was that stronghold known as Masada, that he was up there, Moab is right across the valley there where David was hiding out, is the only stronghold known to that area. In verse 5, and now the prophet Gad said to David, don't stay in the stronghold, depart and go into the land of Judah. So David departed and went into the forest of Herath. For you guys, if you want some extra reading here about this section that we're studying, if you read Psalm 57 and Psalm 142, those are the ones that David penned during this time. It's amazing read to be able to read those over as David's on the run right now. In verse 6, and Saul heard that David and the men who were with him had been discovered. Now Saul was staying in Gibeah underneath a tamarisk tree in Ramah with his spear in his hand. Guy carried a spear every place, right? And all of his servants standing around him. Then Saul said to his servants who stood about him, hear now, you Benjamites, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards and make you captains over the thousands and captains over the hundreds? All you have conspired against me, and there is no one who revels to me, and my son has made a covenant with the son of Jesse, and there is not one of you who is sorry for me or revels to me that my son has stirred up my servants against me to lie in wait to this day. And so, of course, we're seeing the picture here, right? He's lying. He's telling everybody that he says, you know what, I'm putting a carrot in front of you. If you come battle with me and if you help me to go get David, I'm going to give you land. I mean, that's something a trick that's been used forever, right? The promise, that false promise, if you do this, you're going to get that. So often I find in life that doesn't happen, does it? You know, but then he starts lying about his son Jonathan again. Now some time has passed, and he hasn't gotten over it. He hasn't forgiven his son, even if his son did wrong. You know, restoration of family members, of people, always starts at forgiveness, willing to forgive. Paul writes about forgiveness, and I think it's a very important point here as he writes the beautiful little book of Colossians. And he says, if you have a quarrel against any, and he's talking about, in the contents, he's talking to the church, and he's talking about family relationship. He says, if you have a quarrel against any, the fact is, people have quarrels. They have disagreements. I would like to think that we never do, but people do, even within churches and other churches. We were talking earlier today where sometimes people feel like different churches are your enemies, and rather they're not. we're co-laborers in Christ, and we shouldn't be battling against them. But Paul says, if you have a quarrel, let me give you a solution to your quarrel. He says, even as Christ has forgiven you, so do ye. He says that's the standard of what we should do in a quarreling situation. And he didn't say, well, what you need to do is you have to prove yourself right. You need to, that guy deserved it, and so you need to carry out a judgment against him. What Jesus says, we as believers, is even as Christ has forgiven you. How much has he forgiven you? Oh my goodness. He's forgiven me totally and completely. In fact, David writes later on, he says, he's taken my sins and he's cast as far as the east is from the west. He says, that's what we should be doing. We should be passing it on to people that we meet and run across. Even when they do wrong to you, we should be willing to forgive because we've been forgiven much. I think one of the things that stopped the flow of the Spirit within people's life is an unforgiving heart. And this unforgiving heart in the life of Saul comes from a place of jealousy. Came from a place, who would think that jealousy would eat up this man where he was wanting to kill him? In verse 9, of course, we get back to this Doeg. Then answered Doeg the Edomite, he's still around, who was set over the servants of Saul, and he says, I saw the son of Jesse, he's speaking up, right? Jesse going to Nob, to Amalek, the son of Ahitub, and he inquired of the Lord for him and gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath and the Philistine, and he gave him this and this and this and this. I tell you, he's heard what Saul said, and I believe that he probably thought, hey, there might be some money in this for me. There might be some, land or property for me. And so he stood up. And so the king sent to call Amalek, the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all of his father's house, the priests who were in Nob, and they all came to the king. And Saul said, hear now, son of Ahitub. And he answered, and he says, here I am, my lord. And Saul said to him, why have you conspired against me? And you, the son of Jesse, in that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, and he should arise against me to lie in wait, as it is this day. When we read earlier in the story, earlier in chapter 21, did we see this happening? Was there a secret, conspiracy going on between David and this priest? I didn't read it, did you? There was just a need. David was hungry. He was looking for bread, and he went up there and he asked for bread. But of course, this twisted mind now is seeing problems in all the situation. And Ahimelech, verse 14, answered the king and said, and who among you, all of you, are servants is faithful as David? And who is the king's son-in-law? And he says he's not only a faithful servant. You remember this. This is your son-in-law who goes at your bidding and is honorable in all your house. Is there anybody like David? And I love the way he answered this. Did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Far be it from me. Let not the king impute anything to his servant or to any of the house of my fathers, for your servant knew nothing of all of this, little or much. Otherwise, the word hasn't gotten from your headquarters over to our little town of Nob. We didn't watch it on the news tonight. We didn't know anything about what was going on. And the king said, in his rage, you shall surely die, Amalek, you and all your father's house. When I see this, and sometimes I don't understand when people murder other people. But when you see this story, you start to understand when rage goes unchecked, where nobody confronts Saul and nobody has him sit down, how it continues out, how it continues to play out. It says, then the king said to the guards who stood about him, turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew when he fled and did not tell it to me. But the servants of the kings would not lift their hands to strike the priests of the Lord. Amen. Good guys, right? They knew better. He says, and the king said to remember I called him at the beginning dog? Because he really was a dog, Doeg. You turn and killed the priest. So Doeg, the Edomite, turned and struck the priest and killed on that day 85 men who wore linen ephod. Also Nob, the city of the priests, he struck with the edge of the sword both men and women, children, and nursing infants, oxen, donkeys, sheep, with the edge of the sword. I believe at this point, when you read in this story, is when the darkness of Satan really does enter into a scene. When somebody gives himself over. And we remember a few chapters earlier, when Saul was a man that was chosen to lead the nation of Israel. And he could have been a man that we would have been hailing even to this day of doing great things. But he chose not to obey the voice of God. He didn't listen to the commandments of the Lord. When you choose not to follow the Lord, you open yourself up to terrible, terrible things that men do to other men. There's no excuse other than he had given himself over to darkness. Verse 20, now the sons of Amalek, the sons of Ahitub, named Avatar, escaped and fled to David. And he told David that the Saul had killed the Lord's priests. And so David said to Abiathar, I knew that day that Doeg the Edomite was there, and that he should surely tell Saul, I have caused the death of all the persons of your father's house. David said, this is on me. He says, I saw that, and I should have did something at that time. And you almost could picture the guilt that come upon David, probably not right at all, of course, because he didn't know what was going to happen. But we can relate to David, can't we? When you see something happen and you said, I should have stepped in. I should have said something. I should have did something. As you look back at it, and one thing that I love about the Bible, it just paints people the way they are. We see the good. We see the bad, and we see the disappointments. And at this time, David, I'm sure, is very disappointed in himself. And he says, then he does something so gracious. He says, stay with me. Stay with me, speaking to this man. Do not fear, for he who seeks my life seeks your life, but with me you shall be safe. He says, I'm going to take care of you. And then as you look at this, and, we don't do too much typology here on a Sunday night, but if you could look forward to the life of Christ, and certainly David in a lot of ways does represent the Messiah to us, and how Satan is told us in the book of Revelation that he's a destroyer. He seeks to destroy. And Jesus came to give life. And the way that men and women find safety is when they come to Christ. And we find ourselves in the Lord. And the Lord would say to us tonight, he says, you know what? I'm going to keep you safe. Satan's still trying to kill me. He's still trying to wipe out any good work that I'm trying to do. But if you just abide in me, I will keep you safe. There are just a few more things of chapter 23, and then we'll wrap it up for tonight, where now David goes to the city of Keilah, and David told David, the Lord then told David, saying, Lord, look at the Philistines are fighting against Keilah, and they are robbing the threshing floor. David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go up and attack the Philistines? Do you see that, what I see? David is praying here, isn't he? He's asking the Lord what he should do. And there we see the problem between two men, King Saul and King David. The power of prayer. willing to bring everything to Christ in prayers, seeking him to lead us and guide us. And he inquired of the Lord. And the Lord said to David, go and attack the Philistine and save Keilah. And David's men said to him, look, we are afraid here. We are afraid here in Judah. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistine? And then David inquired of the Lord again. Drop down to verse 7. And Saul was told that David had gone to Keilah. And Saul said, God has delivered him into my hand, for he has shut himself into and entering a town that the gates are bars. Great commercial for 2 weeks from tonight. How does David get him out of this jam? I think it's going to be exciting because I believe that David's going to rise to the throne and he will be king no matter how many things Saul tries to do to defeat him. When God has a plan for us to do and things for us to do, it doesn't matter how many pot shots the enemy takes at us, does it? Because God's going to accomplish the things that he seeks to do within our hearts. Because why? We are his poema. We are his workmanship. And he's performing the things that he wants us to do through us. Until that day that our life ends here on earth, the enemy could take a swing at us, but he can't stop us. He can't stop us from following him. We could stop ourselves by stop listening to the Lord. But God forbid that we would do that. Why would we ever do that? I think the story tonight we could see the folly when we stop listening to the Lord. May we just, even tonight, seek to listen to God and to follow him all that much more. Why don't we go to him in prayer? Father, we thank